I want the right to choose and control my health, and we see that generally as a self-evident right in BC. But not so if you're a First Nations person, and even less so if you are a First Nations female. Sacred and Strong is a recently published report from the First Nations Health Authority focused on the health and wellness of First Nations women and girls living in BC. The purpose of the report is to help women and girls reclaim First Nations teachings and protocols around birth, pregnancy, and mothering, empowering them as life givers and ensuring that that empowerment is restored. The report contains data from a wide range of sources. It encourages and embraces a holistic health approach, highlighting the many ways that First Nations women and girls can and are thriving. The report also lays bare systemic barriers that have created health inequities, along with steps to move beyond a hostile history in Canada. While encouraging or acknowledging, the pain and suffering of treatment within the healthcare system in Canada, the report also shows the way forward. Sacred and Strong is about First Nations women and girls as the hearts of their communities and nations. The FNHA says these women and girls are the current and future matriarchs of their communities. They are the life givers, the grandmothers, mothers, aunties, sisters, and daughters who are vitally important caretakers of First Nations culture. They keep it alive, and they keep their communities strong. They are, and have always been, both sacred and strong. I invited Dr. Shannon McDonald, the Acting Chief Health Officer of the First Nations Health Authority, to join me for a conversation that matters about developing supportive systems that are the roots of wellness that ensure healthy bodies, minds, and spirits of First Nation women and girls. Dr. McDonald, welcome. Why is this report so important and so important now?
Some of the answer to that goes back a ways. About 10 or 12 years ago, there was a report about the health of First Nations women in BC. It was written by healthcare providers and epidemiologists and public health doctors like myself, but it did not reflect the lives and reality of the women it was about. It was done to them, it was done about them, it wasn't done with them and for them. So in the interim period, FNHA has been created, has evolved, and came to time when this report had to be renewed and said, no, we need to do this differently. We need to do this with women, for women, so that they can open any page in this document and see themselves. It's not a technical document. It is a series of stories supported by statistics, so that people can use it in their lives to make the change they need to make.
Why is it so important that it be story-based?
No, that's really about the culture of the communities it reflects. The oral history of our communities is very, very strong. And even though there's lots of academic information sort of tucked into these stories, it's the stories themselves that have the real power, that tell us the status of health service delivery to these women, the successes, the barriers, and the ways forward. Those all came from those stories. And we're using them to build program to support the women as we go forward.
So what is the way forward? You know, I in my introduction, I noted that there is a holistic approach. How important is that holistic approach in seeing a way that we are? I'm going to just step back just a little bit because I want to give you a little bit of a sense of my understanding of what a holistic approach means. To me, it means that we put the person at the center of their own well-being and then say, these are the resources that are available to you to ensure that you have the best possible health. Do I have that right? And if so, how important is that, especially as we try to empower women and girls in First Nations communities?
You do have it right. I think there's more elements to it than what you described. Definitely the individual and the person at the center. But First Nations Health Authority is based on a perspective of wellness that not only puts people in the center, but recognizes that there are aspects of wellness, mental wellness, spiritual wellness, which is often ignored in other health systems, emotional wellness, cognitive challenges that people might have that may get in the way, or that may be the gift that they have to be able to move forward in the context of family and community and environment, land, which is so important to First Nations people and communities. Those are all elements of wellness. And to just look at an individual without reflecting all of those other factors in their wellness, it's an incomplete picture. So we want to make sure not only are there supports and services that deal with the physical wellness or the mental wellness of an individual, but that the environment in which they live and thrive is healthy as well.
So how do we do that? How do we bring together what has now become sort of a mainstream medical or allopathic model and then make it work within traditional First Nations healings and ways of wellness? How do we bring those two together so that these women benefit?
I think there's two things that are major changes, major shifts that we need to make. One is what I mentioned earlier, where systems are created to do for, to do at individuals, families, and communities, as opposed to taking all of those siloed programs, taking health, taking childcare, taking child and family services and other social services, employment, education. Those are all pieces of that wellness picture. So instead of working in silos, and I've worked in government long enough, I know about silos, those silos can have major pathways and successes within that limited realm, limited mandate. We need to blow up those mandates. And we need to understand that a family can't be well if there's no food security. A family can't be well if the kids can't get a decent education in a safe place that's culturally safe for them. That rather than giving a foster parent thousands of dollars to care for a family of children, supporting the parents themselves financially, socially, and in other ways to give them the skills they need to parent their children. So there's a different way to turn that wheel from that sickness model and the deficit model that's so common when referring to First Nations people to a wellness model and a resilience model that recognizes the survival of First Nations people and cultures. And there really is a path forward.
There is a path forward, but I can't help but also recognize that it's challenging, because if we take a look at why so often First Nations communities were cut off from access to healthcare, many of them are in remote locations. There was not a willingness or desire to reach out. And we still have those communities that are in areas of the province that don't have easy access to the kind of opportunities that are going to allow people to experience that full breadth of, I guess, self-actualization that makes them feel well, that encourages them to eat in certain ways and exercise, all these elements that we know that are important to health. And so, as you say, we have to come at this not just from a health perspective, but also from the perspective of saying, how do we, bring greater opportunity and prosperity to these communities? Is that possible?
It's a complex picture, absolutely. But there's a couple of things that are foundational to change. One of them is reflecting on the fact that the structures that provide all of these things were not built to advantage Indigenous people. They were built, created, supported, and continue to be supported to serve the majority of the non-Indigenous and non-BIPOC communities in Canada. That there is privilege within all of those education, social services, health systems that is unfair and unwarranted. And I worked for the federal government as a medical officer. I've done fly-in only communities. It's very, very challenging. We have some really heroic nurses that work in those places without a whole lot of clinical supports or other resources around them, but it's not enough.
Oh.
And if we during COVID, one of the structures that really fell apart is the primary care structure. Doctors shut their offices and went online. So First Nations Health Authority developed the Virtual Doctor of the Day program that allowed for physicians within the region that communities live to answer those virtual calls and be the alternative to face-to-face primary care in communities, because those services just didn't exist. They disappeared. And what we found over time was that mental health and other challenges in the community were really rising in the context of COVID. They had always been there at a problematic level. So the program added supports in the mental health and substance use and addiction services area. Program is developed with Perinatal Services BC to provide remote supports for pregnant moms and new moms so that they got what they needed during that period of time, because we were really worried that people that weren't getting the kinds of services they need put not only themselves but their children at risk as well. So, where we could, we've stepped in, but those shouldn't be emergent or urgent situations. It should be, what can we do differently to make this an equitable situation?
Right. So when you talk about those shouldn't be urgent or emergent situations, because in those, I guess, interactions, you're bringing sort of an acute care model to what is something that is more systemic, has longer term implications, when in fact what you want to be doing is working with people to help them take ownership of their own wellness and build upon that. And I think that this is what you're talking about, being able to create that environment that says, we're here to support you. And in doing so, you feel better and the community benefits as well. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
It sounds idealistic, but it is possible. And I think the other thing that we need to think about when we're doing this work is how I define my wellness may not be how you define your wellness. Should the woman of my certain age in a remote community who has hunted and fished and gathered the majority of food for her family for winter not have the supports to enable her to do that in the same way that somebody gets money to go to a grocery store in the South? Those, the pieces that are valuable to individuals and families and communities may not be the same things that those of us in the South value, or those of us from a privileged, educated community value. It's a very different piece of work. If cultural values are the primary interest, COVID has been a disaster because people have not been able to gather, ceremonies have not been able to happen, and people are feeling eroded by that. The naming ceremonies that we talk about in the report are very important to women as they transition from girls to women. If you don't have the opportunity to do that with the teachings that go with it, there's a huge gap in somebody's development. And we want to be able to support communities to have that knowledge exchange so that the knowledge users and the language keepers can fully participate in the community and teach the youth, so that there is a continuity of life and culture as we move forward.
I can't help but go, okay, so what's my own relationship with the healthcare system? I don't interact with it very often, but I know that it's there. And the reason that I ask this question is I go, okay, for me to be as healthy as possible, I have to take some ownership of that, but I also have to know that the resources that I need when I need them will be there. And so I'm happy to hear that we were able to move through COVID. Maybe one of the positive outcomes is that there might be easier access to healthcare providers so that somebody can say, look, I got a problem, or I'm struggling with this. How do I deal with it? I think that it's this interesting, ability to know that the resource is there, that it's accessible, and it will provide me with the guidance that I need to once again take ownership of my own well-being. And is that what we envision for, First Nations women and girls?
There's another layer to that you're missing. And it's when I go to the door to receive those services, I will be treated with respect. I won't be treated in a racist way. I will get equivalent resources and service to other people that are there. And we know from the In Plain Sight report that Dr. Trapella-Fond released a year ago that isn't always the case. So it's more than having a resource out there somewhere. It's I can safely and effectively use that resource to support me in my journey towards health.
So then this report isn't just directed at First Nations women and girls. It's directed towards everybody who's within the healthcare system to say, we're in this together.
We're in this together, but our women are in charge. Because I think that's also another piece. And again, the do for, perceive a need and fill it, come running to fill it, be the heroes. That isn't necessarily the way this is going to move forward in the best way. First Nations Health Authority is the only one of its kind in Canada. We've only been around for 13 years. We've been evolving consistently since in areas like primary care, where the federal government never used to play a role. So there is a lot of work being done so that this groundswell of self-determination and strength and resilience can come to the fore and be a partner to those healthcare system services and professionals at an equal playing field. And the voices have the same validity, not just the technical language and information and data, which is a big part of my training and my role, but what does that mean to the people in community? What are they going to do with it? And how do we provide it to them in a way that they understand what it is, how it can be used, and what it is as a tool to move towards wellness for them and their community?
I have to tell you that last night I was at an event that focused on complementary and alternative medicine, CAM, therapies and treatments. And one of the interesting elements that came out of this is this growth out of CAM to SIM, complementary and integrative medicine. But 2 or 3 times in this panel discussion that I was moderating, the element of spirituality, spiritualism, our relationship to not just ourselves, but our communities and the world as a whole plays a really important role. And I think that, when I think about First Nations health and wellness, I know there is this very strong connection to the earth and, spirituality. How important is it that women and girls understand the value of this to them, and that the medical community will also appreciate and accept that this is an important part of their well-being?
Different Indigenous cultures across the country talk about this differently, but probably the common elements we hear about most are the connection to land. And we've been doing some work with our communities in trying to better define that, to turn it into an indicator we can measure success with. And water. The one of the traditional roles of women in communities was as the water keepers. And understanding through ceremony and through utilization of the water appropriately and protecting it, those were really critical roles in the wellness of communities. Those are elements that are intrinsic to our way of knowing and being as Indigenous people. And you can't weave that out. It's my grandmother used to talk about it as threads in a blanket. There are things in our lives that are so intertwined you can't pull them apart, and still have integrity. So you can make it into a big pile of thread, but then it loses the integrity of what it is. And I think we want to honor that spiritual element, support people in doing what they need to do to learn about it for themselves and to protect it, and to share it with each other. And those are huge. And when I talked about, COVID impacting ceremony, for many, many years, traditional ceremonies were outlawed. Materials from the potlatch were stolen, and made a whole bunch of people rich as artifacts. But that's not what they are. And that's not what potlatch was. It was an opportunity for a community to come together in prayer with drum and song and dancing, to tell stories, to use the language, and to celebrate that spirituality. And in the big houses, there's no floors. You always dance with your feet on Mother Earth. Those are always really important elements to all of this. And it's not entertainment. It's not a party. It is a prayer. It is a spiritual event. So it's really hard for people who have not had that knowledge or experience to understand sometimes, but we have to allow people to develop that spiritual side of themselves in their wellness journey.
Well, I appreciate the report. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I hope that it is going to help empower women and girls in First Nations communities to, have the best possible health outcomes for themselves. Thank you for your time today and in sharing this, these very important insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.